Operation Passage to Freedom was a term used by the United States Navy to describe its assistance in transporting in 310,000 Vietnamese civilians, soldiers and non-Vietnamese members of the French Army from Communist North Vietnam to South Vietnam. The French and other countries may have transported a further 500,000. In the wake of the French defeat at the Battle of Dien, the Geneva Accords of 1954 decided the fate of French Indochina after 8 years of war between French Union forces and the Viet Minh, which sought Vietnamese independence. The accords resulted in the partition of Vietnam at the 17th parallel north, with Ho Chi Minh's communist Viet Minh in control of the north and the French-backed state of Vietnam in the south. The agreements allowed a 300-day period of grace ending on May 18, 1955, in which people could move freely between the two Vietnams before the border was sealed. The partition was intended to be temporary, pending elections in 1956 to reunify the country under a national government. Between 600,000 and 1 million Northerners moved south, including more than 200,000 French citizens and soldiers in the French army, while between 14,000 and 45,000 civilians and approximately 100,000 Viet Minh fighters moved in the opposite direction. The mass emigration of Northerners was facilitated primarily by the French Air Force and Navy. American naval vessels supplemented the French in evacuating Northerners to Saigon, the southern capital. The operation was accompanied by a large humanitarian relief effort, bankrolled in the main by the United States government in an attempt to absorb a large tent city of refugees that had sprung up outside Saigon. For the U.S., the migration was a public relations coup, generating wide coverage of the flight of Vietnamese from the perceived oppression of communism to the free world in the southern dictatorship. Under American auspices, the period was marked by a Central Intelligence Agency-backed propaganda campaign on behalf of South Vietnam's Roman Catholic Prime Minister Dien. The campaign exhorted Catholics to flee impending religious persecution under communism, and around 60% of the North's 1 million Catholics obliged. Background: at the end of World War II, the Viet Minh had proclaimed independence under the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in September 1945. This occurred after the withdrawal of Imperial Japan, which had seized control of the French colony during World War II. The military struggle started in November 1946 when France attempted to reassert control over Indochina with an attack on the northern port city of Haiphong. The drive was recognized by the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. On the other hand, the Western powers recognized the French-backed state of Vietnam, nominally led by Emperor Bao Tai, but with a French-trained Vietnamese National Army which was loyal to the French Union forces. In May 1954, after 8 years of fighting, the French were surrounded and defeated in a mountainous northern fortress at the Battle of Dien. France's withdrawal from Indochina was finalized in the Geneva Accords of July 1954, after 2 months of negotiations between HO's Drive, France, the PRC and the Soviet Union. Under the terms of the agreement, Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel north pending elections in 1956 to choose a national government that would administer a reunified country. The Communist Viet Minh were left in control of North Vietnam, while the state of Vietnam controlled the south. French Union forces would gradually withdraw from Vietnam as the situation stabilized. Both Vietnamese sides were unsatisfied with the outcome at Geneva. Dien, Prime Minister of the state of Vietnam, denounced France's agreement and ordered his delegation not to sign. He stated, "We cannot recognize the seizure by Soviet China of over half of our national territory, and that we can neither concur in the brutal enslavement of millions of compatriots." North Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Van Thuong expressed bitterness after his Soviet and Chinese backers threatened to cut support if he did not agree to the peace terms. Dong had wanted to press home the Viet Minh's military advantage so they could lay claim to more territory at the negotiating table. Under the Accords, there was to be a 300-day period in which free civilian movement was allowed between the two zones, whereas military forces were compelled to relocate to the respective sides. All French Far East Expeditionary Corps and Vienna forces in the north were to be evacuated south of the 17th parallel, while all Viet Minh fighters had to relocate to the north. The Accord stipulated that civilians were to be given the opportunity to move to the preferred half of Vietnam. Article 14 of the Accord stated that any civilians residing in a district controlled by one party who wish to go and live in the zone assigned to the other party shall be permitted and helped to do so. Article 14 allowed for a 300-day period of free movement between the two Vietnams, ending on May 18, 1955. The parties had given little thought to the logistics of the population resettlement during the negotiations at Geneva, and assumed the matter would be minor. Despite claiming that his northern compatriots had been enslaved, Diem expected no more than 10,000 refugees. General Paul Ely, the French Commissioner General of Indochina, expected that around 30,000 landlords and business executives would move south and proclaimed that he would take responsibility for transporting any Vietnamese who wanted to move to territory controlled by the French Union, such as South Vietnam. French Prime Minister Pierre Mendès France and his government had planned to provide aid for around 50,000 displaced persons. Mendès France was sure that the FFEEC would be able to handle the work all by itself. The Americans saw the period as an opportunity to weaken the Communist North. Evacuation. The predictions made by Diem and Ely were extremely inaccurate. There had been heavy fighting in northern Vietnam, where the Viet Minh were at the strongest, and many people had been forced to abandon their homes. Although French charities had been operating in the north, the refugee camps were disorganized and were able to provide little more than shelter. As a result, there was a great number of northerners who wanted to leave and start a new life in the south. The French started their evacuation with the preconceived notion that few would want to head south. As knowledge of the migration program spread through the communist-controlled north, thousands of predominantly northern Catholic asylum seekers descended on the capital Hanoi and the port of Haiphong, both of which were still in French control. This led to anarchy and confusion as the emigrants fought over limited shelter, food, medicine and places on the ships and planes that were bound for the south. By early August, there were over 200,000 evacuees waiting in Hanoi and Haiphong. Initially, the ad hoc camps had insufficient sanitation and water quality control, leading to the possibility of outbreaks of disease. Some American representatives said that they were the worst conditions they had seen. The conditions continued to be poor and chaotic after the evacuation got into full swing, and did not improve significantly for a month. There was no organization infrastructure as far as registration of medical records and immunization of the waiting evacuees. The communists thus sent the propaganda activists through the camps and said that the lack of organization proved that life for prospective refugees would be even worse in the south, where they would be completely under the control of South Vietnam. The French Navy and Air Force had been depleted during World War II. They were unable to deal with the unexpectedly large number of refugees. This was exacerbated by their unwillingness to allow civilian evacuees to travel on trains from outlying districts to Hanoi and Haiphong, as the priority was evacuating the military personnel and equipment. France asked Washington for assistance, so the U.S. Department of Defense ordered the U.S. Navy to mobilize an evacuation task force. The American government saw the evacuation as an opportunity to weaken the Communists by providing for and thereby winning the loyalty of the refugees to the anti-communist cause. The United States Operation Mission proposed that aside from helping to evacuate refugees to the south and thereby draining the communist population base, the Americans should provide health care, shelter, food and clothing in order to help the anti-communists win the fidelity of the compatriots. Another benefit of participating in the evacuation was that American personnel would be on the ground in North Vietnam, allowing them to gather intelligence on communist activities. Accordingly, Task Force 90 was inaugurated under the command of Rear Admiral Lorenzo Sabin. U.S. servicemen renovated and transformed cargo vessels and tank carriers to house the thousands of Vietnamese who would be evacuated in them. The repairs were frequently done en route to Haiphong from the bases at Subic Bay in the Philippines. Sabin had no prior involvement in humanitarian matters, and he and his staff prepared Operation Order 2-54, the 114-page policy framework for the operation, in the space of a week during the sea voyage from Japan to Vietnam. The first U.S. vessel to participate in the mass evacuation was the Menard, which left Haiphong on August 17. It carried 1,924 refugees for a 1,600 kilometers, 3-day journey to the southern capital. By this time, there were already 132,000 people registered at the waiting areas, although very few had any identification. As a result, there would be more work to be done in identifying the needs once they arrived in the south. The Montrose followed on the next day, with 2,100 passengers. Both were originally built as attack transport vessels. In August, the U.S. policy was liberalized so that Vietnamese and French military personnel could also be evacuated at the discretion of CTF-90 and the Chief Military Assistance Advisory Group. To cope with the rising volume of southbound sea transport, CHMAH established a refugee debarkation site at Vung Tau, a coastal port at the entrance of the Saigon River. This site relieved congestion in the Saigon refugee camps and decreased the traffic bottlenecks along the river. A setback occurred when a typhoon struck the Haiphong area, destroying almost half of the refugee staging area. Despite the problems, by September 3, the U.S. Navy had evacuated 47,000 Northerners after only 2 weeks of operations. The high rate of evacuation caused the South Vietnamese government to order that only one shipment of at most 2,500 passengers was to arrive in Saigon or Vung Tau per day. Until September 25. The population pressure in the south was eased as incoming numbers fell due to Viet Minh propaganda campaigns and forcible detention, combined with the rice harvesting season, which had prompted some to delay the departure. Some were even waiting to finish all the business deals before moving in the Lunar New Year. On October 10, the Viet Minh were given full control of Hanoi, closing off one point of evacuation for those who wanted out. Some also decided to stay behind and see how the Viet Minh would treat the inhabitants of Hanoi before making a decision on whether to leave their ancestral lands. On October 20, the French authorities that were still in control of the ports decided to waive docking fees on U.S. vessels engaged in the evacuation. Because of the high demand, the naval vessels had to travel quickly. One ship completed one round trip in a record of only 6 days. The record for the most passengers taken in one journey was set by the US General Black, which sailed on October 29 with 5,224 Vietnamese aboard. In November, the evacuation was further hampered by another typhoon, while the entire crew of one American vessel were struck down by a scabies outbreak. In December, because of Viet Minh obstruction, which prevented people from rural and regional areas from traveling to Hanoi and Haiphong to emigrate, the French Navy sent ships to hover just off the coast near the regional town of Dien to evacuate refugees. According to COMIGAL, the South Vietnamese government agency responsible for the migration, French aircraft made 4,280 trips, carrying a total of 213,635 refugees. A total of 555,037 passengers were recorded on 505 sea trips. The French Navy accounted for the vast majority of the naval evacuees, with 388 voyages, while the U.S. Navy made 109. British, Taiwanese and Polish ships made 2 and 4 journeys respectively. The official figures reported that a total of 768,672 people had migrated under military supervision. Of this number, around 190,000 were French and Saigon soldiers and returned prisoners. Some 43,000 were military dependents. 15,000–25,000 Nung tribesmen who were military auxiliaries, between 25,000 and 40,000 French citizens, and about 45,000 Chinese residents. Quote, "It also included several thousand people who had worked for the French and Vietnamese administrations in the north." The official figures recorded that more than 109,000 people journeyed into the south by their own means, some arriving outside the 300-day period. These people typically crossed the river that divided the zones on makeshift rafts, sailed on improvised watercraft into a southern port, or trekked through Laos. As of 1957, the South Vietnamese government claimed a total of 928,152 refugees, of whom 98.3% were ethnic Vietnamese. The 1957 report said that 85% were engaged in farming or fishing for their livelihood and 85% were Catholics, while the remainder were Buddhists or Protestants. However, an October 1955 government report claimed that 76.3% were Catholics, 23.5% were Buddhists and 0.2% Protestants. In 1959, however, the head of COMIGAL, Bui Van Luong, admitted that the actual number of refugees could have been as low as 600,000. The official data excluded approximately 120,000 anti-communist military personnel and claimed that only 4,358 people moved north, though no historians consider this number credible. The northward migration was attributed to itinerant workers from rubber plantations who returned north for family reasons. An independence study by the French historian Bernard B. Fall determined that the U.S. Navy transported around 310,000 refugees. The French were credited with around 214,000 airlifted refugees, 270,000 seaborne refugees and 120,000 and 80,000 Vietnamese and French military evacuees respectively. During the U.S. Navy voyages, 54 people died on board, and 111 babies were born. Fall believed that of the 109,000 refugees who went south by their own means, a large number hitchhiked on southbound French transport vessels that were not related to the migration operation. Fall felt that the figures were likely to have been overestimated due to immigration fraud. Some refugees would travel south and register themselves before smuggling themselves onto vessels returning north for another shipment of humans. They would then return south and re-register to claim another aid package. Likewise, with instances of entire villages moving south, the authorities frequently did not explicitly count the number of villages, but simply took the word of the village leaders. The chiefs would often inflate the population figures to claim more aid rations. The mass exodus did not disrupt the north largely because whole villages often emigrated, instead of half a village moving and leaving the remainder of the community in disarray. Fall estimated that around 120,000 Viet Minh troops and their dependents went north. Most of these evacuations were attributed to Viet Minh military strategy, with some being ordered to stay behind in readiness for future guerrilla activities. The northward movement was facilitated by vessels leaving from assembly areas at Quien Hon and California Mao at the southernmost extremity of Vietnam. The voyages to North Vietnam were provided by empty French ships heading back north to fetch more southbound anti-communists, as well vessels from communist nations such as Poland. The Viet Minh also actively cultivated the Montagnard indigenous people of Vietnam, whose land in the Central Highlands was encroached upon by incoming northern settlers. The communists spread propaganda through broadcasts in tribal languages and infiltrated the highland areas. According to a study by the Michigan State University group, some 6,000 tribespeople went north with the communists, accompanied by some Viet Minh who had adopted the indigenous culture. The largest numbers of Catholic refugees came from the two northern dioceses with the highest percentage of Catholics in Vietnam. These were Phat Diem and Bui Chu, mainly located in modern-day Ninh Binh and Nam Thin provinces respectively. The bishops of the dioceses had been strident opponents of the communists, and both had organized Catholic paramilitary groups that fought against the Viet Minh, which had long identified Catholics with colonial collaborationism. When the communists had gained the upper hand in the north, many Catholics had already begun making preparations to move to the south, where the communists were less influential, and large movements began immediately when news of the partition came through. After the defeat of French Union forces at Dien Bien Phu, French officers had evacuated the troops from Bui Chu and Phat Diem to reinforce the area between Hanoi and Haiphong, which they still controlled, making it very easy for the communists to progress through the Catholic strongholds. The French withdrawal was not announced and was supposed to be secret, but the local church leadership found out quickly, and the local Catholic community had already begun to move to the ports before end of talks in Geneva. By the time the accords were signed, 45,000 Catholic refugees were already waiting in Hanoi, Haiphong, Haiduong. According to the records of the Catholic Church, over 70% of Catholics in Bui Chu and Phat Diem left, compared to around 50% in most other areas. The Catholic records claim that only a third of Hanoi Catholics left, and that around 80% of all clergy left. In all areas, a higher proportion of priests left than laypeople. which has been attributed to the Communists inflicting heavier punishments on more prominent opposition figures, such as clerics. The departure rate was also lower in areas further removed from the coastal areas and departure ports. In Hung Hoa, only 11.8% of Catholics were recorded by their diocese as have migrated. It has been speculated that the low rate of Hanoi residents choosing to depart may have been because the city was relatively untouched by the decade of fighting, and that the varying and high rate of departures among rural Catholics was due to the influence of the local clergy. Priests in northern Vietnam were noted to be more theocratic and involved in civic decision-making. They used a variety of ways to persuade the disciples to migrate. Some explained the belief that circumstances would be difficult for people who did not immigrate. Some simply gave dogmatic reasons such as God is not here anymore, while others gave no reason at all and made declarations such as "we are leaving tomorrow," in the expectation that the followers would obey without question. Surveys on the immigrants suggested they were largely content to follow the recommendation of the local priest. In some areas, the bishop in charge of the diocese told Catholics to stay, but lay people were more likely to leave or stay depending on the stance of the local priest with whom they had regular contact. In many cases, such as in Hanoi, a majority of priests ignored the bishop and left anyway. In many cases, families left some members behind in the hope that they would retain land for the family. While there were reports that a minority of Catholics with links to the Communists decided to stay willingly, the U.S. provided emergency food, medical care, clothing and shelter at reception centers in Saigon and elsewhere in the South. American sources donating through the United States Operations Mission were responsible for 97% of the aid. The USOM sent public health professionals to help with sanitation in an attempt to prevent the spread of disease. Doctors and nurses were sent to help train local workers in healthcare procedures, so that they would eventually be able to take care of the medical needs of refugees. In order of contributions to the aid efforts, the U.S. were followed by France, United Kingdom, Australia, West Germany, New Zealand and the Netherlands. Australians sent farming equipment and accompanying technical instructors under the Colombo Plan, with most of the refugees being Catholic. The voluntary agencies most prominent in helping the U.S. and French governments with humanitarian relief efforts were Catholic. The National Catholic Welfare Conference and Catholic Relief Services contributed over $35 million and sent hundreds of aid workers to South Vietnam. U.S. clerics such as Joseph Harnett spent more than a year supervising the establishment of humanitarian and religious projects in Saigon. These included the establishment and maintenance of orphanages, hospitals, schools and churches. Harnett's volunteers fed rice and warm milk to 100,000 refugees on a daily basis. Tens of thousands of blankets donated by the American Catholic organizations served as beds, makeshift roofs against monsoonal downpours and as temporary walls in mass housing facilities. The United Nations Children's Fund contributed technical assistance and helped to distribute merchandise, foodstuffs and various other gifts.